All right, it's been a couple of minutes, so let's get started. I don't see anybody else joining in virtually as well, and we got folks in the room. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Again, thank you for joining this really important session. My name is Maziar Mobasagi. I am the Chief Disaster Recovery Officer for the State Housing and Community Development Department, HCD. I'm joined by a wonderful panel today, and I'm going to give a quick little bio introduction in a second. But if I could frame up this meeting and this panel, based on the quick research I've done, this is the first full panel Housing California has had focused solely on post-disaster housing recovery. This is the long-term permanent housing recovery. And as the wildfires since 2017 have shown us the hazards in California, the combination of wildfires and earthquakes, really now natural disasters impacting vulnerable populations, is a question of when and where, not a matter of if. We are all experiencing significant wildfires. With the drought this year, we anticipate additional wildfires this year, and there's the ever-present danger of seismic activities in our urban areas. So we really are hoping that this panel, as an initial panel, will help frame and educate the stakeholders around the housing community around the context of a post-disaster housing recovery, because folks, it looks a lot different. Not just physically as you're seeing on the picture before you, but in situations, we're talking about situations where City Hall might not exist for you to go to be able to pull a permit, or the infrastructure that's needed to allow for your housing development to move forward is not there. So post-disaster housing is a unique challenge. In addition, it impacts the most vulnerable members of our communities. Those with the least amount of resources are impacted the most, yet are asked to burden and carry the burden the most around recovery as well. And we really wanted to highlight this issue for policymakers, planners, affordable housing developers, to really begin thinking about what are these impacts and what is it that we need to do moving forward in California. There are literally hundreds of bills being considered around housing in the state capitol, yet only 2 are focused on post-disaster housing recovery. Yet this is a critical issue because the most vulnerable in our community are most impacted. Yes, they have the least to recover from. So today's panel, and my introduction is not going to do justice to the amazing panel members. Their bios are on the WOVA app. I encourage anybody interested to really look at this amazing panel. They've done amazing work. But for today's discussion, we're joined by Shauna O'Shaughnessy, who is a CEO and president of Community Housing Improvement Program, CHIP, and also a board member of the California Coalition for Rural Housing. She's going to speak from her experience as through CHIP of having a multifamily project, affordable multifamily project being burnt down in the Camp Fire. So she'll give us the on-the-ground experience of what it's like to experience that disaster and what recovery really looks like. Following Shauna will be Catherine Kungu, Housing Disaster Recovery Specialist at HCD. Catherine's going to take information we have learned since the 2017 disasters and really provide a larger scale analysis of what this impact really looks like. And I really encourage you to look for some information in our presentation about how long it takes to do housing recovery. It really is an immense challenge measured in decades, not just years. And then the third member of our panel, Ann Wine from the U.S. Geological Survey, is going to be talking about the haywired fault scenario. Ann's part of a team working on this particular fault in the East Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, to really show what a natural disaster in an urban area through a seismic hazard is going to look like, and will also be eye-opening for a lot of the folks in Housing California, for planners, for developers, for policymakers, to really see what tools are available out there for us to do some pre-disaster planning and preparation to really get prepared. Because as you will see, and I'm going to be turning the microphone shortly to Shauna, these disasters really are a huge impact on the community, not just housing development, which then exacerbates the pace and scale of recovery. Part of Catherine's presentation will also highlight the limited amount of federal resources that are coming in, which then raises some questions about what are some appropriate state policy actions in this arena. So I've talked a lot. I want to encourage our audience members, put your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer them. Even if you don't have specific questions for us as panel members, as I mentioned, this is the first panel in Housing California looking at post-disaster housing recovery. We're open and we're curious to get some questions from you all about what are the type of questions policymakers or others should be considering as we're looking into this topic. So let me turn the microphone over to Shauna, who's going to share her experience. So Shauna, again, thank you for joining us today. You had the only multifamily affordable project destroyed in a Camp Fire, and we'd love to hear what your experience was like. So the microphone's yours.
Thanks, Maziar. I realize that the folks in the room can't see the panelists right now, but I think at the end we'll probably switch to the screen where you can see all of us. So the slide in front of you, really, it is impossible to understand our region's affordable housing crisis without understanding the lasting impacts of back-to-back disasters, particularly the 2018 Camp Fire. Next slide, please. The back-to-back fires have created a hole in our housing stock that is negatively impacting everything. We have escalating housing costs, both rental and home ownership. There is a lack of inventory. We have increased cost of construction, labor shortages, potential economic stagnation as employers struggle to attract workers. And like everyone else, all of these issues were exacerbated by COVID-19 with its supply chain disruptions and economic instability. Next slide, please. In spite of it all, we remain a resilient community. We have developed best practices that are being replicated across the West as we learned how to work together as a region. Most importantly, we have become a model for communities rebuilding in a more climate resilient way. Last year's Dixie Fire started in the exact same place as the Camp Fire, but burned away from the residential areas in Butte County. It burned in the direction of the fuel, and really showing that fuel reduction efforts work. Next slide, please. As most of you know, the Camp Fire was the deadliest, most destructive fire in California history. Unfortunately, the 2020 North Complex also had the greatest losses in Butte County, with just over 2,300 structures destroyed. Next slide, please. Because of our demographics, housing stock, economic profile, much of our population was extremely vulnerable to the effects of a natural disaster and lacked the resources to recover. These are the folks that Maziar was highlighting. The people with the least resources take the longest to recover. And after the fire, there was simply nowhere for people to go. And now, more than 3 years later, we still have a significant number of people who are experiencing housing and economic instability. Next slide, please. In addition to the loss of structures and housing, our infrastructure took a huge hit. For several months, PID, Paradise Irrigation District, thought that the entire water system was contaminated. Fortunately, it wasn't, but that was scary times. And while we have overcome many of the barriers listed on the screen, we still have tremendous infrastructure needs, from road reconstruction to developing sewer for the first time in the town of Paradise. And the cost of insurance is one of the biggest unknown and long-term threats to recovery of housing and business. Cost increases have already started impacting affordable housing operators across the state, where there hasn't even been a fire, but are near for us. Next slide, please. In addition to the visible destruction, there are deeply felt impacts. We cannot underscore just how widespread the impacts of this disaster have been on our region. Next slide, please. The large map shows FEMA application locations right after the fire, and it shows the diaspora of our community after the Camp Fire. The largest number of impacted people do remain in Butte County, with Los Angeles area absorbing the second largest number. But you can see that fire-affected families relocated across the country. One of the absolute saddest and most difficult aspects of the fire was that entire extended family units lost their homes, leaving folks without their normal support networks. The inset map is from Chico State's tracking program. They continue to track where people have ended up 3 years later, and you can see that folks remain spread across the country. Yes, thank you. So now I'm going to pivot to the challenge of rebuilding after a disaster using Paradise Community Village as a case study. Next slide, please. Prior to the Camp Fire, our region was starting to feel the pinch of the statewide affordable housing crisis. Wages were not keeping up with costs, and this was before the current inflation pressures we're feeling. Then the Camp Fire just blew a hole in everything. Historically, the market has provided a significant portion of our affordable housing. For decades, local builders were able to address much of the first-time home buyer entry-level market. And we had a significant stock of older housing that was used as rentals. Mobile home parks, we lost over 30, provided deeply affordable housing. It is simply impossible to replace this housing stock to the same levels of naturally occurring affordability. There needs to be intentional investment and deep subsidies to even begin to scratch the surface of our need. As you can see from the slide, for those of you who can, it's big if it's big enough, there has been kind of wide fluctuations in our population over the last 3 years. We had an overall significant loss of population in Butte County, but Chico gained a large number of folks. Glenn and Tehama, our neighboring counties, also have seen some movement. But even with a overall reduction in our population, we have seen increased homelessness. Next slide, please. This is Paradise Community Village, our 36-unit apartment complex that burned in the Camp Fire. It is a low-income housing tax credit project that was completed for the first time in 2013. It is a family project with a mix of 1, 2, and 3-bedroom apartments. We successfully completed the reconstruction last year and are fully leased up. We ended up rebuilding it using insurance, FEMA public assistance, and private donations. The demand for this project was extremely high. When we opened the project for applications, we received over 250 applications in 2 weeks for 35 available units. We had applications from former residents, campfire survivors, and new residents to Paradise. However, the rebuilding this project after a disaster was incredibly difficult. Next slide, please. We faced multiple challenges. So the first and biggest challenge was the threat of tax credit recapture. IRS code requires that you rebuild within 25 months after a disaster. And given the scope and scale of this disaster, we knew that that was impossible. With the support of advocates across the country, we were able to get an extension under COVID to 3 years and successfully rebuilt and did not face tax credit recapture. Funding. So the FEMA public assistance, absolutely a godsend. We couldn't have rebuilt without it, but it is a very, very difficult funding source, and we're still navigating it even though the project is over. The infrastructure issues in the town, so the debris removal, the tree removal, just the utilities being brought back, everything was just a little bit harder. And then obviously we were building during COVID-19 and all of those additional issues. We have a wage complaint against this project. We ran it as Davis-Bacon because it was FEMA direct to us. But some of the unions think that it should be state prevailing wage. And so we're still kind of wading through that. And then of course, insurance. So we finished this project and it was right when the Dixie Fire was happening and we almost were not able to insure this project. And our federal and state funding sources say that you have to have 100% replacement value in your insurance. So ultimately we paid almost $200,000 for property insurance. We have full coverage, but obviously that is not sustainable, as it's 2/3 of our gross receipts. And then while this project was not subject to CEQA, any other projects that don't mirror a footprint in the bird scar are subject to CEQA, as there's no CEQA exemption in WUI, which is the wildland urban interface. So unfortunately, Paradise Community Village, while it was the first, is not the only and will not be the only multifamily project that is completely destroyed by a natural disaster. And it is absolutely essential for us to make the process of rebuilding easier in order to support the recovery of our tenants. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these challenges are bigger than Paradise or even Butte County. As I was preparing for this session, I did a quick poll of a few of my colleagues and revealed that each year, thousands of vulnerable low-income seniors, families, and individuals with disabilities have either been evacuated or under the threat of evacuation. And these properties are not just located in small, remote mountain communities. They are across the state. And then this slide lists, several, and there are other multifamily properties that have been burned in the last few years. But something that almost every single affordable housing developer operator is experiencing is the impact on the cost of insurance across California and the West. Regardless of their location. It is becoming one of the greatest current threats to the affordable housing industry, with regular premium increases and fewer carriers. Some projects are struggling to secure any insurance at all. Next slide, please. All right, so what is working in affordable housing? I must say that the disaster credit tax credits were a godsend. They have enabled the receiving communities in our county to start to address the affordable housing deficit. Ironically, I think that the city of Chico is going to hit their RENA numbers in the first 3 years because of these disaster tax credits. Unfortunately, they haven't helped the town itself rebuild. And part of that is because they came, really quickly after the fire, and some of the requirements tied to them. And then also because they're variable, you get disaster tax credits if you've had the bad luck of having a disaster in the previous year. So it's a little bit hard to kind of plan ahead a pipeline of projects around them. And then I list some of the other things on this slide that are working in affordable housing post-disaster. Next slide, please. So what's not working? So a lot of these disasters that I'm talking about are happening in rural communities. The ones that my fellow panelist Anne is going to talk about will be mostly urban focused. And there is an urban bias in HCD and LIHTC scoring and funding formulas kind of across a lot of the programs. And I list some of the issues that are part of that. There needs to be better coordination of state funding sources with CDBG-DR. It is millions, in the case of the 2018 allocation, billions of dollars. But we lose it if we aren't able to match it because it's only providing 40% of a project. So we need to be able to pair it either with LIHTC funding or some other source of state funding. I already talked about insurance, can't underscore that enough. And then something that is being felt across the state, but was really kind of started by the wildfires and then COVID, is the rapidly escalating cost of construction. And then in rural communities impacted by disaster, we're really watching how the housing element enforcement plays out. While I think that it's really, the accountability is important, and there are communities that have been resistant to building affordable housing, there are some communities that truly just don't have the staffing capacity. There is a desire, there is a need, they recognize it, they want to build it, but they have a planning department of one, they have a consultant, working on grant writing, and they just don't have the capacity. So we're interested to see how this plays out in small rural communities impacted by disaster. Next slide, please. So the path forward, I think that there needs to be increased state support for disaster recovery with dedicated funding. There is AB 1945, which would kind of pre-fund some of the disaster recovery projects before CDBG-DR hits the ground. I think that there are regulatory fixes that could be made that are pretty easy that would level the playing field for rural or disaster projects. And then I know that there's been work on better coordination and improvement, and I think that that needs to continue. And then at the federal level, you know, kind of continuing to make CDBG-DR more efficient. And then I think there needs to be whole-scale reform in disaster recovery. I think that a lot of the programs are not designed for catastrophic destruction like a wildfire. And then there's a role for private philanthropy. You can't ignore economic development in the wake of a disaster. The relationship between housing and the economy is never clear when you kind of lose all of it. And then I am again going to talk about insurance reform. I think that there are solutions that have been used in other countries and across the state that would create a backstop that would keep the private market in the insurance in these areas. And then community-wide mitigation to make communities more resilient, both before and after a fire. I think that there's really an opportunity for bipartisan collaboration, and we really need to take those opportunities that are before us. And then my last slide is just some of the resources that I pulled to put this slideshow together. So thank you so much, and I turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Shauna. Thank you for sharing your experience. I hope audience members and everybody really got to hear and see and feel how difficult this recovery was. But most importantly, I hope everybody saw that this just wasn't something that impacted Shauna or Chip or the tenants living in a particular project. I hope you saw that even a disaster that happens in a corner of Butte County has rippling implications all the way down to LA County. And that even if you don't look at a tenant issue, if you're looking at insurance issues, impacts in one part of the state are increasing insurance costs for everybody. So this really is not an issue that's isolated, as Shauna was mentioning, in one part of the state. So in our next presentation, I want to turn the microphone over to Kathy Kungu. Kathy's going to help us scale up and look at these disasters in a little bit of a broader time frame and a broader geographic region. So Kathy, the microphone's yours.
Thank you, Mazia. Thanks again for the invitation to speak to everyone. My name is Kathy Kungu. I am the Disaster Response Recovery Specialist here at HCD. You know, California's wildfire season just rages on, and impacted communities know that the disaster recovery resources are uncertain. From our experience, these funds could take more than 3 years to reach the disaster impacted communities. So today I'll just want to review the disaster impacted. I'm going to review the lessons learned from the wildfire recovery efforts from 2017 all the way through 2021, and then also the opportunities that exist to improve equity as communities embark on various planning efforts. So at HCD, our mission is to preserve and expand a safe and affordable housing opportunities, and also to promote safe, vibrant, inclusive, sustainable communities for all Californians. HCD provides funding to stably house folks who are experiencing homelessness, veterans, farm workers. And the picture that I have in the slide is our NOFA calendar. It's really on our website. And for the programs that that provide funding to help meet the 2.5 million homes that are missing, and that were also included in the new released statewide housing assessment. In addition to administering program funding, HCD is also the administrative agency for overseeing California's first green building code, which is a Cal Green. It's the first in the nation. It's a state-mandated green building code. And then finally, HCD serves a different role. It serves as a lead agency of the housing recovery function under the California Disaster Recovery Framework. I want to bring your attention to the disaster recovery and the impact of replacing new building activities in the community. So as Shauna mentioned, the Camp Fire was the deadliest and the most destructive in wildfire in California's history. The Camp Fire decimated the region's affordable housing stock based on if you looked at the statistics that Shauna provided. Some of those residents that were displaced temporarily were able to return to their homes in a matter of days, especially for the folks who had resources, but others lost their homes entirely and faced rebuilding from the ashes left by the fires, while others were just permanently displaced, relocating across the country and also across the state. So thinking about the infrastructure during the Camp Fire, 8 of the 9 schools in the region were damaged and destroyed. Only one of them has reopened 6 months after the fire. So there's a lot of children that were impacted and families. Approximately 80% of the town of Paradise was destroyed by the Camp Fire. And early in the presentation, Shauna had provided just the migration patterns of the Camp Fire or the Camp Fire survivors. So prior to the Camp Fire, Paradise has always been was extremely affordable because it had an easy commute to Chico. It was a historically retirement community because of its affordability, and then again its proximity to Chico too. After the Camp Fire, Paradise lost a lot of its older population, with half of the 65 and older population moving 30 miles beyond the fire. So the Camp Fire really destroyed 16%, or about 13,906 homes in Greene County, 5,000 manufactured home units that were impacting 3,451 low-income households. Prior to the fire, the average annual increase of housing units in the county was 440 units. And if you can see in that chart, in 2020, the highest increase of housing units over the last 10 years was just 675. So you can see what the rebuilding efforts look like. So for vulnerable communities, the receiver communities for those displaced by the Camp Fire were in Chico, Oroville, Biggs, Gridley. And to keep in mind that the migration shift raised other concerns for the other surrounding communities. So increased vacancy rates for those communities, higher rents, and then other issues related to a sudden increase in population. So what resources are available to a community after a disaster? So HCD administers DR funding, and I wanted to bring your attention to when HCD receives funding and how those funds address various needs. So housing, in the chart, you can see that housing includes both single family and multi-family programs to address the needs of homeowners and also renters impacted by the wildfire. When you look at the infrastructure, this includes funds, the match from the FEMA Public Assistance Match, as well as a standalone public infrastructure program. This funding is for infrastructure categories that are in support of housing, such as sewer, utilities, and roads. And then when it comes to the economic development, so just think about the workforce development resource to help train workers to build back the community or building and in the construction trades. When it comes to planning, the funding is provided for capacity building, to provide capacity building for both the county and also at the municipal level. Additionally, the planning funds are used to prepare the local and also statewide resiliency mitigation plans. In administering the DR funds in the single family space, HCD altered the maximum assistance award from 200,000 to about 500,000 in the owner occupied housing rehabilitation reconstruction program. This is the OR program. And this is just really an example that how these funds, the DR funds, do not come close to making a community whole. DR funding provided about 12 and 14% of the unmet needs recovery for the 2017 and also the 2018 fires. To bring CBDG funding, HCD is required to develop an action plan. It outlines the goals and objectives of the CBDG funding. The department goes through a robust stakeholder engagement, and this process usually takes about 2 to 3 years from the disaster. Shana mentioned extensively about insurance, and the United Policyholders is an insurance consumer advocacy nonprofit group that surveyed survivors from major California disasters. The group's data showed that in Butte County, 65% of the survey respondents reported that their homes were underinsured. In the San Diego fire, the United Policyholders state that 66% of the victims reported that their policies did not fully cover the cost of rebuilding their homes. In fact, the United Policy owners stated that they met homeowners who believed that they were underinsured between $200,000 to $400,000 in gap in funding. Other impacts for the disaster survivors include navigating FEMA. The deadline to appeal for a FEMA decision is 60 days from the date marked on the FEMA decision letter. Late appeals may be accepted, but upon showing a very good cause. So if FEMA does not respond within 90 days, then the appeal is considered denied as a matter of law. So as you can tell, this process is complicated for survivors, especially to navigate fresh off a disaster. The cost of rebuilding has risen significantly over the last couple of years, and it continues to rise. Due to the reconstruction and labor shortage, as well as supply chain shocks for building materials, if these increased costs are not factored regularly into the insurance coverage, especially for disaster-prone areas, homeowners will be left with huge losses. In a 2019 report from CoreLogic, look at the chart there. On the insurance coverage, they identified 110 Southern California properties in very high to extreme risk of wildfire. With an average so they would have a regular average reconstruction cost of an estimated $400,000. The risk to rebuild the same 110,000 homes is more than $46 billion if there was a wildfire, because a wildfire completely destroys the structures. So if 1% of the homes were at risk, and that's what the chart shows, were at a complete loss in a wildfire, given the rise in costs, given the increase in reconstruction costs over the last 2 years, you'd actually see a 5.6% significant increase in the cost of labor and material. So I mentioned the action plan as part of the CBDG process to receive state funds. So as part of the action plan development to receive these DR funds, HCD is required to prepare an unmet needs analysis. So what you see there is the 2017 needs assessment. What it details the quantified losses resulting from the disasters and resources available to address the identified losses. So for 2017, the data indicates that we had more unmet recovery needs than resources available to to address those needs. And in 2018, the picture is no different. The losses or the needs far exceed the CBDG funding received from the federal government. HCD is committed to pursuing additional resources and leveraging other resources to support the state, to support the long-term recovery. Our team really continues to work closely with local, state, and federal partners with respect to really collecting ongoing data so that we can identify the resources and also understand how we can be able to meet, how we can be able to articulate the unmet needs over time. So here's just a brief synopsis of the CBDG funds that we have received from 2013 all the way through 2021 in response to the disaster declarations. So CBDG funds must be approved through Congress through a supplemental appropriation act for each disaster. HUD then releases a federal registered notice for each year that outlines how those CBDG funds will be distributed in the grant cycle. So there is no standardized framework for the use or the allocation of this fund, especially for each of the years. So HCD must prepare an action plan. We have to go out for stakeholder. We have to go out for public comment through our stakeholder engagement process for the declaration, for the federal disaster declaration. So as I mentioned earlier, we have more unmet needs recovery than the resources that are available to address them. The CBDGDR is often one of the only recovery tools available to jurisdictions to provide vital resources, especially to benefit the low, moderate, and income community, especially when we know that insurance does not factor in. As HCD receives this funding, we typically propose disaster recovery programs to help address equity issues that we see. However, we know that the funding is inadequate to address the struggles that our households, the LMI households, face during post-housing recovery. So as I mentioned earlier, it takes about 2 to 3 years for HCD to receive that funding. We have to go through that stakeholder engagement process. However, for developers, affordable housing financing is complex, and it requires developers to resolve the short-term acquisition, pre-development, site development, identify the construction financing before they even present a project to HCD for funding. So it is really difficult for communities rebuilding after disaster, since they have to compete for other resources from other well-resourced communities. So from our experience for multifamily housing, it takes about, for the project to be built and occupied, it takes about 3 to 7 years after the disaster. Infrastructure around the project so you can be able to have the home habitable. It takes about 1 to 6 years. And then also putting together all of that financing takes about 3 to 7 years after the disaster. And then for single family housing, this is for our low income homeowners. Again, it takes about 3 years after the disaster for the home to be built and occupied. Again, for those infrastructure, for the infrastructure to be completed, it takes about 1 to 6 years. And then for the homeowner to obtain that financing and funding, it takes about 2+ years after the disaster. So we do have some takeaways and some recommendations for our participants. We ask folks to be involved in the stakeholder engagement process, get local housing and community development emergency management teams jointly produce the post-disaster recovery plans through your planning efforts. Use these plans to identify projects, potential financing, and also funding gaps early. The thought is that we would hope that folks are aligning and integrating their planning efforts to assist in the long-term recovery efforts. These efforts accelerate and incentivize housing production by promoting, you could promote innovative housing types. So when you have a project, you can think about an ADU, you can think about manufactured home, tiny homes, so you can be able to reduce the development costs. Help identify the gaps in resources and the systems needed for disaster recovery, especially for vulnerable populations. So households in Butte, Lake, Shasta counties were mostly impacted, and the data showed that half of the owner-occupied households were severely cost-burdened. That means that they were spending 50% of their income on more than 50% of their income on housing. So we encourage local jurisdictions and our stakeholders involved in the local planning efforts to use the data from survivors and track them over time so that we can unlock more resources either through the state or the federal legislative processes. And I'm also saying allow to build back better, more housing units. So for example, in the WUI areas, use the wildland urban interface of the WUI building codes, because they were developed specifically to incorporate fire prevention elements into housing construction on properties built in areas where there was certain amount of wildland fuel. Although adhering to the WUI standards is already mandated for any substantial rehab or new construction by state law, many of the existing structures that were built 30 to 40 years lack these life-saving elements. So jurisdictions should envision how disaster-prone areas can be redeveloped and where the housing development can be increased. So really thinking where the rebuilding efforts should be concentrated to and where to enforce the WUI building code so that they can address long-standing environmental issues, justice issues. Some of the efforts that the state we do work to coordinate with other state agencies. So the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection is updating their fire hazard severity zone maps. The local governments use these hazard maps as a guidepost in deciding where new homes and businesses should be approved or rejected. These new regulations and maps will seriously impact the housing development, infrastructure, and also bear some costs on insurance, and will also impact insurance costs. HCD, CAL FIRE and CAL OES, we regularly meet so we can be able to increase the awareness on our mitigation grants and projects, especially at the community level. We promote the coordination of program administration by really seeking the opportunities where we can leverage each other's resources. As part of the $536 million in the wildfire prevention bill, funds were provided to CAL OES and CAL FIRE to implement a home hardening program. The program does provide community and homeowner wildfire education on defensible space and also home retrofitting. It provides a framework of community collaborations of local resources and how to perform home hardening and defensible space work using CAL FIRE's wildfire home retrofit guide. It also provides direct financial assistance to support that home hardening work for vulnerable and also low-income homeowners. Right now, they have identified 3 pilot communities in Shasta County, San Diego, and also in Lake County. And then finally, through the Office of Planning Research, OPR's Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, they develop a holistic strategies to coordinate climate activities at the state, regional, and local levels while advancing social equity. And so with HCD, we see that because we align, the CBDG Mid-Citizen Advisory Committee is just a great fit for us to coordinate programs implemented so that they are consistent with the climate adaptation and the displacement policy. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you for sharing that information. And just a reminder again to everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A. Some of them are getting typed immediately. Some of them we're putting in queue to be able to address at the end of the presentation. And I hope what the audience took away from the presentations from both Shauna and Kathy, folks who've been in the trenches that are doing actual disaster recovery, a lot of what they're saying is that we need to be prepared before a disaster hits. Because once the disaster hits, with everything that you got to deal with all the underlying factors that have really created our statewide housing crisis, post-disaster housing recovery is really hard. So Kathy was starting to talking about alignment around different planning options to really account for vulnerable communities, to make sure that they're seen, their needs are accounted for, and we're prepared for when the disaster comes. Because again, this is California. At this point, wildfires are seismic. It's just a matter of where and when, not an if. So our next presenter, Dr. Ann Wine from U.S. Geological Service, is going to talk about the Hayward scenario. This is the Hayward fault in the East Bay area, the San Francisco. And what I hope the audience really takes away is the level of analysis and the tools that are available to us in the affordable housing community. But we got to take this information and build it into our plans in order to be prepared. So, and microphone's yours.
Right, thank you, Marzia, and also to Kathy and Sienna for really setting me up, because they make it real. And earthquakes, very similar story, but in our case of a very much larger scale. So that's another problem to consider. I coordinated many aspects of the Hayward scenario. It's an earthquake sequence in the San Francisco Bay Area, so we don't give you a break. It keeps going for years. Today, I'm speaking about communities at risk, which is found in volume 3 of our societal consequences. Now, Laurie Johnson, who's a recovery researcher and practitioner, was our lead author, and thanks to Jamie Jones, Jeff Peters, also of USGS, for their spatial analyses that Marzia is referring to. So our purpose was to provide a long-term perspective of the impacts that a major earthquake could have on communities in the Bay region. Typically, our scenarios are used often in response exercises, and it's always a challenge to try and help communities think beyond that. So next slide, please. As we do in all of our work, as we draw heavily on prior disasters to build our models. And so understanding the risk of population displacement and other long-term recovery challenges is well informed by 3 disasters. That's the 1994 Northridge earthquake. It caused extensive damage to older multifamily housing and led to a major federal, local, multi-year, multi-million-dollar effort to address the resulting blight in neighborhoods and to repair buildings in what was called 17 ghost town neighborhoods of Los Angeles. Another disaster is the flooding from Hurricane Katrina that displaced 90% of New Orleans' 455,000 residents, with severely damaged areas having profoundly lower rates of population return than less damaged areas. And socially and economically vulnerable populations also had lower return rates than other cohorts, speaking to our theme of socially vulnerable communities. By 2015, and 10 years on, the city had recovered about 80% of population. But nearly half of its 72 affected neighborhoods still had less than 75% of their pre-Katrina population. That was a lot of numbers, but I think you get the idea that 10 years later, there's still a lot to return to sort of a more pre-disaster condition. And the third example is quite close to my heart, and that's the 2010-11 Canterbury earthquake sequence in New Zealand, which resulted in as many as 10 distinct episodes of liquefaction and rockfalls, and a government buyout offered to buy more than 7,000 properties in red zone areas. You can see on the map on the slide. that cause regional housing shortages and cost inflation, as we've already spoken about, as well as homelessness and relocation. So replanning of these red zone areas continues today, again, over 10 years later. Next slide. So in contrast to the wildland fire disasters in the rural areas, mostly that we've been learning from, the haywire scenario is an urban and regional disaster to plan for. So this haywire main shock, its magnitude 7 earthquake on the Hayward Fault, is centered in Oakland. There is heavy shaking along much of the East Bay and into some of the valleys, as well as some strong aftershocks in parts of Silicon Valley. That's just one possibility for aftershocks. There is a cascade of hazards and damages from main shocks and aftershock shaking, fault slip, liquefaction, landslides, and fires. Next slide. Just to hone in on the fires, since that's what we've been talking about, fires following an earthquake occur from broken gas and electrical lines and falling objects. And some fires spread when the response is hindered by delays in communications, shortage of fire trucks, damaged roadways and bridges to get to the fire, and broken water pipes, which is critical because they can cut off water to fight the fires. Next slide. So in our community at risk analysis, it's situated in this building here, and the first floor is all the earthquake hazards that were integrated, and the second floor is building damages and utility and transportation disruptions. And then on the third floor, we have our community at risk, which looks at concentrated damage, like the ghost town neighborhoods after Northridge, and like the central business district during the Christchurch earthquake, where there is so much damage that it affects everything in it, whether you're damaged or not. And the second point of our work is to look at the socioeconomic vulnerability of people living in these areas because of the population disparities after Hurricane Katrina, and previous speakers have noted. And thirdly, recovery issues. And we've had quite a bit of discussion about assembling funding for recovery, which is going to allow me to be brief about that. Repairing and replacing damaged housing, and areas requiring substantial governmental intervention and replanning, like those Canterbury red zone areas. So next slide, please. So what does it look like? What's that pattern of concentrated damage for our scenario? And you can sort of see three maps here of all buildings considered, and then just multifamily to try and get at that neighborhood blight effect when you have a lot of multifamily buildings damaged in an area. And then also to look at the single family alone buildings. And the yellow, the orange and red areas are like 20% or more extensive or complete damage to buildings. Now this number is, could be higher, could be lower. It was determined by consulting with various disaster researchers of what they had observed in previous earthquakes. So these areas are showing up in the East Bay corridor, in San Ramon, Livermore valleys, and in the flatlands around San Francisco and San Pablo bays. Now, field work conducted in these areas found densely developed neighborhoods with older, seismically vulnerable single family and multi-family wood frame buildings that can be heavily damaged by shaking and are quite vulnerable to post-earthquake fire spread. So again, just note that regional pattern of the disaster. So thinking about different factors that force people from their homes, often the thinking has been quite narrow and around whether your home itself is solid enough to stay in it. And in our scenario, that would be maybe about 400,000 people. But that grows to 650,000 people if we add in our fire damages after the earthquake and think about the effects of utility outages causing people to leave their homes. And now if we take this other perspective of your whole neighborhood is affecting your ability to stay in your neighborhood, then the numbers go up to 600,000 to over 1 million people. So there's a huge range in how you determine and think about what are the factors that will affect people's ability to stay in their homes and their neighborhoods. And there's other stresses too, like environmental health incidents and aftershocks would further aggravate household displacement. Next, please. Yeah. So who's in these areas? Well, once again, the vulnerable populations are disproportionately represented in these areas that we have mapped. And the distribution of community vulnerability characteristics are shown here, with the most affected people in central Alameda County for our particular earthquake. And the transportation cost burden is one of these indicators for vulnerability. It's a large contributor in communities which have low overall community vulnerability. It's once we get race, ethnicity, and housing cost burden and education become more dominant as the community vulnerabilities increase. In addition to community vulnerability, we look for areas with high concentrations of school-age children because people will move if there's no school. We looked at homeless populations that have no homes to lose. We looked at households with residents with disabilities that would be sensitive to disruptions to the services that they depend on. And we also considered young and mobile populations that may be less tolerant of damage and disruption because they lack ties to the region. I guess we saw some of this during the pandemic, that some people could up and leave. Next, great. So anyway, this map here shows you a lot of overlays of analyses that can help tell all the stories and the factors influencing different communities in different ways. So we've got the concentrated damage, we've got the most vulnerable communities, we've got where there's heavy concentrations of renters and black cash, and then we've got concentrations of young and mobile households. So it's just trying to layer the effects and contrast what the different community recovery situations could be. Next, so this is a very wordy slide, but thanks to Sienna and Kathy, they've actually explained a lot of this around sort of the funding challenges, assembling those funding resources and the problems, delays and limitations. But I think some of the points are just the numbers here. You know, we're talking about 1 million residential buildings damaged, 137 million housing units involved, and 90% of those could have slight to moderate damage, but that may not exceed insurance deductible. So therefore insurance won't be a source for them. They're going to have to go to these other sources that have been previously discussed. Nearly 100,000 residential buildings, single family, duplex and some multifamily, you know, will have that heavy damage where insurance coverage can kick in and maybe cover about 12% of those losses. So again, there's a big unmet needs in Kathy's language there about how all that's going to be repaired. So the problem is, of course, the low-income property owners, mortgage defaults and affordable housing. Thanks for going to the next one. So this is the added perspective of our study. It's not just talking about how many homes and who's in them, but again, it's looking at these regions which are going to be really challenging to recover, like a fire heavily concentrates an area, so can an earthquake for different reasons. And those reasons are, in the first box, liquefaction and landslides. The second box is potential surface fault rupture, including afterslip. So during the Napa earthquake, there were buildings right on top of that fault that kept moving. And then there is concentrated building damage that I've discussed to show you how that concentrates problems in an area. And then areas with substantial transportation and infrastructure damage. So all of these areas could face combinations of these challenges, and uncertainty about the feasibility and affordability of repairs can lead to the mortgage defaults, occupant displacement, property blight, and declining property values. So an array of governmental interventions and replanning actions will be necessary, and thanks to Kathy to be thinking about all those, and they all will require money as previously discussed. So let's go on to the next one. We're just going to conclude with what we came up with as some recovery opportunities, and again they line up with what you've heard building more housing in the first place, but building it for all income groups. Not just fire, being resilient to fire, but also to seismic hazards in California in our land use and development policies, and all the related hazards of earthquakes, so liquefaction and landslides. Thinking about those population movements, we saw them go all over the country and into LA, and being ready for that when we were talking about many more people. Plan for the management of long-term recovery of all levels of government, and to echo Kathy's point, across emergency management and urban planning together. They're not isolated functions when it comes to recovery. And finally, to develop a recovery financing strategy, which thanks to the prior speakers for really talking a lot about that. So last slide. Just want to thank you for the opportunity to share our work on this important panel.
Thank you, Anne. I think this presentation is very sobering. I saw somebody jet out of the room. I have to tell you, the first time I saw this presentation by Anne, those numbers absolutely made my heart sink. 600,000 folks displaced or impacted by a single fault is a significant change. And I hope the audience saw that when we talk about disasters, a lot of what we do in the housing world and real estate seems to be all local, but this is not a local issue. The rippling effects of the displacements of insurance costs, housing costs, rent costs are far and wide. And I hope this presentation really open the eyes and lights and hearts of our community members that are only in urban areas thinking, well, these disasters have only been in wildfires and nothing for me to worry about. No, the type of regulatory work, financial work, planning work that we're talking about is very applicable to urban areas, because again, it's a matter of if not when. So that's the end of the presentations. We wanted to keep these short and sweet so we have time for discussions and questions, and I appreciate some folks have already put some questions in the queue. We will answer a few of those live. I had a couple of specific follow-up questions to the panel members first, and then we were going to go to those. And I wanted to start off with Shauna, and I'm wondering, Shauna, from your perspective, what are some pro-housing policies that should be considered now to really aid long-term recovery after a disaster?
Thanks, Maziar. Hi, everyone. So as we're discovering now, as we're looking to apply for multifamily, CDBG-DR multifamily housing, that in order to be able to utilize these funding and also disaster credit funding, is that you have to have projects that are in the right zoning. So a lot of communities have not properly zoned enough of their communities to allow for multifamily housing. So I think that zoning is incredibly important. We talked about housing elements, and so really thinking proactively about pro-housing policies before there's a disaster, because when you have a disaster at the scale, you're digging out of a hole that is impossible to dig out of. But really having pro-housing policies to begin with are important. I think the CEQA in the WUI is challenging to being able to rebuild quickly, and then at the state level, like I said, being able to pair these federal resources with state funding more easily would be incredibly helpful. And then fast tracking projects, some relief on amenity requirements would be incredibly helpful, both in the state programs and LIHTC when you have a disaster of the scale of the Camp Fire. So we no longer have a hospital in the town of Paradise, for example. So the clinics and the ability to score. And then even with the rural guidance, some of the proximity requirements for grocery stores and bus lines are hard to achieve. So that's just like 5 ideas.
No, thank you, Shauna. Obviously been thinking about this. Shauna, I also wanted to give you the microphone. There was a question from the audience you wanted to answer. I think it's kind of ties into some of the discussion. So did you want to answer that one before I go to my next question?
Is it the first one about Butte County?
Yeah.
Do you want to read it for the folks that are in the audience, and maybe if
I forget. Yeah,
people online weren't following the Q&A?
Question was, this was to Shauna, home and rental prices have increased dramatically in Butte County since the Camp Fire. Do you think this will ever level out, or will Butte County become unaffordable for renters, first-time homeowners?
I'm scared for Butte County, and I'm scared for rural communities across California. I lived in the Bay Area for 20 years and saw this escalating cost of housing, making it really difficult for people kind of earning a normal income. So if you weren't like in a tech company, you could no longer really afford to live even in a modest apartment, or achieve home ownership without some sort of support. And when I moved back to Butte County, housing was still affordable, but it was starting to go up in the wages. There was complete disparity between wages and where the cost of housing was going. And then we've talked about this many times. The loss of 14,000 units was, catastrophic. And so now you have low inventory, you have high rents, and the ability to attain wages to afford it is becoming impossible. So it feels like we are just following in the footsteps of the Bay Area, of Sacramento, and all of the kind of radical steps that need to be taken in these urban communities need to also be taken in Butte County and other rural communities. And I think that there's a lack of understanding. Butte County is, because the Camp Fire has the microphone, but across rural communities, there is an exploding homelessness population. There's an increasing affordability issue. And so we also need drastic interventions to achieve affordable housing for our residents. An example that I've used, as a percentage of our population, our population of people experiencing homelessness is comparable to LA County and San Francisco County. At the time of the 2019 point in time, we don't have the numbers for this one, but it's only increased since then. And I think that it feels less visible because we don't have downtowns, but it is a problem. So bad news unless we band together and really do something serious.
Yes, speaks so much to the need for really building back more, building back better, but really when you have a housing crisis and then you add this other layer of crisis on it, what the impacts are. And so true, Shasta County, Lake County, Mendocino, Sonoma, Napa, and even Santa Cruz, Ventura, all echoing the same issues as Shauna mentioned. But let me, I wanted to throw a question to Kathy. Kathy, then, wasn't CDBG-DR supposed to solve all these issues? So like, why isn't CDBG-DR solving all this problem?
As I alluded in my presentation, CBDG funds do not come near, do not even come near to the amount of unmet needs recovery that we see on the ground. So it's just inadequate resources to rebuild after disaster. And so some of the things that we really try to have our local jurisdictions think about leveraging other funds, using your existing planning processes, so that you could, think about building a project pipeline, understanding what the timelines are for the different resources that are available to you, knowing that you also have to compete with the likes of the LAs or Sacramento's and all the large size, all the large size and well-resourced communities. And so, you know, knowing that we don't have CBDG funds or the CBDG funds are inadequate, we really need to think about what processes are available in the local community, and then also what other resources are available at the state. So having your staff be aware and build that capacity so that you could be ready to build back better.
That's a good point. And the other thing I'd like to add to that is to bust the myth of CDBGDR addressing any recoveries, any community's real recovery. HUD relies on FEMA data, and FEMA automatically disqualifies any homeowner, including LMI households, that indicate they have any kind of insurance. And you heard from all the presenters, insurance gap is significant. So there's an entire population missing from the allocation formulas, in addition to some of the complexities that Kathy mentioned in the FEMA individual assistance application process that has this downstream effect as well. I understand we have an audience question from somebody in the room. I see you holding on the microphone. So yeah, please, from the room.
Hi, so thank you so much for that presentation. It was really fascinating. I do wonder, you know, as in California, we're clearly facing a future where these natural disasters will increase. And how do you think through how we balance getting people back in their communities versus kind of addressing the reality that some places might just experience these natural disasters over and over again? And where do we rebuild? Like, where do we put those limited dollars?
I'll take a shot first at this, but I definitely open to the panel members to share your perspective as well. From our perspective, from an HCD perspective, there's always challenges to building across our state. As we mentioned, like if you saw in Dr. Wine's presentation, there's always been seismic issues. There's parts of the state that are more prone to flooding, and now significant areas prone to wildfires. It's a matter of taking in those risks and into factor as we're rebuilding. So, and I'm going to go to also respond to one of the questions that came in the Q&A, and that was a question about the sewer system in the town of Paradise. And I think this will help answer the question from the room. The town of Paradise was the largest municipality west of the Mississippi without a central sewer system. When the federal government allocated CDBGDR requires a direct tie back to the disaster, in the sense that the statute and federal regulations really say this money is intended to replace what was lost. Now, you do have to build it back better, but it's intended to build back what was lost. And here the sewer system didn't exist. So we're working with HUD, we're working with the town to make the argument that with a sewer system in place, a town like Paradise can build more dense housing in its urban core, and then surround it with some of the state investment through CAL FIRE, through mitigation resiliency, forest thinning projects, to then protect that investment of housing in the town's core. So from our perspective, wildfire activities need to be taken into account when you're accounting for building, and communities do have to look at where is it better to build more housing. Panel members, I didn't know if there were anything else you wanted to also add, or from your perspective, if it was any different.
Maziar, I think you answered it very well, that unfortunately across California, there's tremendous risk. And I think that Dr. Wine's presentation about earthquake risk, while it's been decades since we've had a serious earthquake, when it happens, it will be far more devastating than all of the wildfires put together. And when you think about a community like the town of Paradise, it's not a small community. It was a population of 30,000 people that was well established. And I think that what needs to be considered is the community-wide mitigation that can be done. And I think Maziar did a great job of highlighting the opportunity for building climate and actually, Kathy, you did throughout your presentation, there's a lot of opportunities for rebuilding back in a more climate resilient way. and then starting to address communities proactively. And just kind of talking about drought, I mean, you have entire towns and communities in the Central Valley that don't have water. And so, so do you move the mountain folks to the Central Valley, but then they don't have water? Do you move them to the city, which has other problems? So I think that it's, okay, how do we make our existing communities safer and more resilient?
So with that, let me ask Anne, I don't know if what you wanted to add, but if you wanted to add to that, but also how do communities then really look at these multi-hazards, and how can they look at it? How should they look at it?
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking. So we're on cue there. Yeah, I mean, I think USGS needs to hear from you all, how you're dealing with multi-hazards and the interactions with climate change. So we have a lot of work we do on all kinds of hazards: earthquakes, landslides, volcanoes, wildland fire, geomagnetism, coastal processes, and inland flooding. A lot of it is there and available, but it can be hard to find it. And so we kind of have three kinds of information. We have what we call our hazard assessments, and they have like time horizons maybe of about 30 years. So longer term planning, and that might be like shaking, what the likelihood of a certain level of shaking that would be used in building codes. And the second kind of information would be situational awareness. So when something happens that then changes the risk of other hazards. For example, a large earthquake would change the risk of more earthquakes, increases it. So we have aftershock forecasts for that. And then a third kind of product, we have a historical event documentation, because it often is very helpful for people to understand. They believe information that's closer to where they live. So those can be helpful as well. But then the challenge becomes the multi-hazards, and what can happen at the same time, or how one changes another. And so to the point of this, when we have all the wildland fires, if that's followed by a heavy storm or an atmospheric river, then we have an increased risk of debris flow. And I sort of wondered if that had actually come up in any of your work around fire so far, when you've got those increased risks because of from what happened with fire. And then the third dimension, of course, is bringing in climate change. And what is that going to do? So more extreme precipitation is going to make those debris flows more severe. And we look at questions like sea level rise and how that interacts with storm surge, how sea level rise interacts with liquefaction hazard because it raises the groundwater levels. So there's a lot there. And again, I'll just finish by saying, the more we can hear about what would help people in their planning in this dynamic multi-hazard landscape, I think USGS can do a better job of packaging the information that can be found.
Absolutely. I just want to echo one thing that you mentioned in your presentation. And I think for us in the housing community, there's a big stakeholder group we need to bring into the housing discussion, and that's the emergency management and response folks. They are now clearly part of the dialogue of how to build back better. And also the experiences of these past few years, they are clearly seeing the need for housing as a key part of a community resiliency. I think Shauna mentioned this in her presentation. The lack of other housing options exacerbated the migration of folks after the Camp Fire, really limited opportunities to provide decent, safe housing for folks. So they are interested in this discussion. They have tools available to them, and folks, they have resources available to them. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is far larger than the total of CDBG-DR that's been allocated to California by factors of 10 or more. Yet some of our most vulnerable communities don't access those resources because the connection between the identification of their needs and planning is also missing a little bit. So, and do you ever see an instance where, well, let me answer your question. I had a quick question for you. Yes, California's experienced debris flows, mud flows in the Santa Barbara area. We specifically had that right after the wildfires over there. So housing wasn't damaged with the wildfires in the area. Housing and infrastructure was damaged based on the debris and mud flows. So those are clearly tied together. I think Santa Cruz experienced that also after the 2020 wildfires. And do you ever see an instance where emergency management folks are showing an interest in housing and would want to be included in housing discussions?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. When I looked at the people who tuned into the Hayward scenario, it was predominantly emergency managers, and we had a small percentage of urban planners types. So it was sort of the other way around, because I think they kind of see scenarios as a good practice tool, right? And I think we've got more work to do in helping the planning side, maybe, use and embrace scenarios. I had an experience on the shakeout scenario when I was we were doing recovery planning for a community, and it took a very long time and a lot of work to convince the emergency manager that he needed everyone in the room, including the economic development person. So I don't think it's obvious necessarily to emergency managers. And once we got everyone there and the economic development person was speaking up, the emergency manager had a big revelation, like, whoa, that's why I need you in the room. So yeah, there's definitely some disconnects there.
Yes, I have to echo, I had this similar experience. We were having a local community meeting in Ventura County about CDBG mitigation. It was the first time that the county public work official, or the number 2 there, was also in the room with the emergency management folks. The public works folks started talking about home hardening and retrofitting, piqued the interest of the local emergency management folks, saying, we've been talking about this, but we didn't know how to do it, but we have the resources to do it. And it was amazing to see how ideas exist on one side, resources on the other side, and we really need to come together for this. And it goes to the question from the member in the room about how to build back better and look into this issue. So critical. I do want to come to one of the questions that was in the panel that I really loved how it was even phrased, if I can find it. Now I'm like, there was a question from about how do we build resilience into disaster relief funding streams? I know Shauna took an answer and kind of writing it in there. I think the other part I would also add to that is, at this point, the only thing that's coming from the federal government is CDBG DR. It is designed in a way to come in late to close gaps in a community. So by design, it comes 2 to 3 years late. As I mentioned, there's whole populations that are missing from this. So it seems one way to build resiliency into it is to twofold. Make sure there's funding that specifically calls out and asks the question of housing needs of vulnerable populations before disaster hits, because we know there's been historic lack of disinvestment, so the infrastructure is poor or old. I think everybody understands the example of flooding, where land in flood-prone areas was potentially cheaper to build on, for instance. But there's this other issue of really, in the interim, federal assistance is only available for a short time after a disaster. What kind of other resources are needed as we're talking about housing recovery in California in that interim period as well? I don't know if the other panel members had anything else they wanted to add to this as well.
Where we see a lot of the disasters is where we see the disaster impacts is in rural communities, and where we know that we have a lot of capacity issues. And so one of the things that we do need to have is more capacity, technical assistance and planning dollars, so we can be able to assist the staff so they can in turn come into the state government. Requests for state resources are very, very complicated to navigate. Most of the time when you're thinking about like a multifamily housing program, you also have to think about your tax credits. You have to think about the 8CD funding that we have. You have to make sure that you understand all of those processes, when to bring in an application, when to bring in, when to apply, when to go back to your board and think about the resistance that is in the local community. I think it's all of those things that you have to think about in addition to thinking about the disaster recovery fund.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. I want to go to another question that came from the audience, and that was the question around insurance. Let me read that. Oh, Shauna.
Can I take a stab at answering it after you read it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the question was, as mentioned several times, fire insurance is enormously impactful for housing preservation, construction, and rebuilding. The California FAIR program plan is too expensive and doesn't offer enough coverage. What specifically is being done about the cost of fire insurance?
All right. So there are lots of conversations happening around what to do about the cost of fire insurance. Can you guys hear me? I'm frozen on my screen. Okay.
Yes, we can.
So the biggest issue is that the reinsurers have exited the market. So they're the catastrophic loss folks. And so frontline insurers are willing to still insure in these communities, but they can't sell the catastrophic loss to the reinsurers. So there's the need to basically stabilize the reinsurance program. And so there is examples with the Federal Terrorism Risk Insurance Act with TRIA, where the federal government said, hey, we'll take the next level of catastrophic. So that kept the insurance industry stable. In Florida, the state said, we're going to pony up the first level of insurance, and then you guys come in after that. And that stabilized the insurance market in Florida after hurricanes in the 1990s. And so there's opportunities for the state legislature to do that. But I think because there are questions about whether or not we should be rebuilding, and it's about fire and kind of urban, there's a lack of appetite to do that without recognizing that a little bit of investment in stabilizing the insurance program will actually save a ton of public money through FEMA and CDBG DR, because you're close to being able to rebuild or be made whole with insurance. Other suggestions out there are improving the California FAIR plan. They've increased limits, but as those who've looked at it know, it doesn't cover everything that a multifamily operator needs. The town of Paradise is seriously exploring community-based insurance, where it's kind of locally funded and people buy into a community base. So you're kind of self-insuring. And then there are other opportunities for folks to maybe create a captive insurance. So basically you're self-insuring, but you work with an actuary to figure out how much money you need to set aside. So a small developer like us wouldn't have the capital to create a captive insurance program, but maybe pooling with a certain number of other affordable housing developers could. So there's, and then United Policyholders, who Kathy referenced, is doing a lot of research around insurance and reform that needs to happen. So unfortunately, nothing in the near term, but there's a lot of activity, and there could be something bold done at the state legislature that would kind of fix it right away. So we need someone bold to make it happen.
Yes, and if I could add to that two things. One other, hopefully another impetus of this change is the fact that CDBG DR, as I mentioned, as it's being currently implemented, really views fire as an insurable event. So any homeowner, including LMI homeowner, is really kicked out of the system and not included in CDBG DR. So if this disaster recovery is counting on insurance, we really do need to have these robust systems. And I see, Anne, you wanted to add to that as well?
Oh, I just had a thought of that, you know, the tie of insurance to mitigation. And so the CEA earthquake insurance is lower if I have retrofitted my home. I just wonder if that was under discussion at all in the fire space.
Oh, yeah. So the thing is that there is a possibility of lower insurance premiums if you've you've protected your home, you've done home hardening, you clear around your house, but there's nothing to force insurance companies to accept those mitigation measures. So there is actually an effort to create an agreed upon set of mitigation measures that will bring insurers back into the market, and kind of that if you do these things, they have to insure you, which there's no requirement for that too. So yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because some do it voluntarily, but it's not guaranteed to get you insurance if you do those things.
Nice. And one other small point to add to that as well is from our engagement of what we're seeing happening with the insurance discussion is right now it's being led largely by the insurance business industry, the research part of the insurance companies, redoing these actuarial studies and redoing the risk models to then for the insurance companies to reassess their deployment and their cost. One of our concerns, and Kathy gets full credit for this, as she's been the one who spotted this and raised this from day one, is in all of these discussions, one of the concerns really for us is an equity issue. The type of requirements that we potentially see coming down the pipeline that would allow for those insurance discounts are significant retrofit requirements. So if you think of a home hardening, making a home ignition resistant, it seems like, again, we're not experts, so don't take this as gospel, but it seems from the handwriting on the wall that you can't just redo the roof with type A material. You also have to have siding redone, and your window covering and sides need to be redone, in addition to defensible space, in addition to potentially sprinklers underneath the roof or above the roof. So it's potentially a very, very costly approach to be able to get there, which raises the equity questions of who's going to be able to afford it. And this is not just also an individual property issue. What we're clearly learning from our brethren at CAL FIRE is this is a community issue. If Anne does a great job of home hardening her house, but Shauna and I are her neighbors, and we have not done a good job with defensible space landscaping, Anne's house will burn when our houses burn as well. So it really does need to be a community-wide effort. And speaking of those community-wide planning efforts, a question for Kathy. What's going on, or what are some activities underway right now to kind of take a more broader, comprehensive look at maybe aligning some of these plans to get us to better visibility of vulnerable populations?
So I know that we at the department are starting these conversations where because we recognize that to discuss resources, especially for the CBDG funding, the largest funding that we received was in 2018 was about $1 billion. And then we know in 2020, we're going to receive about $238 million. And then it was just announced that in 2021, that we'll receive $14 million, which is not even enough to meet the unmet needs that are faced in this community. And so what we're working on is really trying to, one, identify the state partner agencies that we need to work with, what resources that they do have, how communities can be able to leverage, and then work on trying to integrate our stakeholder engagement processes together, so that we are now having a cohesive approach to rebuilding. We're having a community approach in even leveraging resources. That in itself is a huge undertaking. It requires a lot of coordination. Not only, we're busting silos literally within state agencies, and it will take increased cooperation at the state level. It will take increased cooperation also at the local level, so that we can have some meaningful impact. My biggest hope is that we can be able to have at least a state DR funding that can mimic the DR funds that are provided by the federal government. But I think in my opinion, I think once we start making these once we have these coordinated efforts, then we can now start asking for bigger gains and supporting Shauna and supporting, and when they're providing, when they're in your work, yeah, pretty much in your work.
Well, I know we're at time. I really want to thank the panel members, Shauna, Kathy, and thank you so much for sharing this information. I hope for the folks who attended, really taking some questions and going back and looking at your developments, your future development patterns, and really beginning to ask the question of, are we accounting for this? So I hope this was informative, and I hope for next year's for Housing California, we planted the seed for having a few additional discussions about post-disaster housing recovery. So again, panel members, thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise, and thank you for Housing California for hosting us. So this is the end of our session. Let me turn it back to the Housing California team.